It is Talk Radio Europe, your voice in Spain. I'm delighted to welcome on the line now Dr. Patrick Moore, talking about his book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Sounds like something from Lord of the Rings. How are you?
I'm very well, Dave, and you may notice the sort of subtitle is, "You Will Perish in Flames." I borrowed that from Ghostbusters because I thought it was such a great line. But what does the end of the world look like?
Yeah.
Does it implode? Does it explode? Do the oceans all catch on fire simultaneously? This is what I wonder when people think they can say this term, the world is coming to an end. What is it looking like?
Well, this is quite interesting because I watch a lot of movies about the end of the world, and some of these great epics. With all that's happening with COVID-19 at the moment, it feels pretty much like a real movie happening. But nonetheless, one of the things which came up before the pandemic was called Greta Thunberg and her campaign. And there was talk of children. I mean, really now with the COVID-19, it's gone another level. But there was talk of children being stressed and kind of made fearful of what is happening in the world. And there was quite a lot of negative criticism around that, of course. But I suppose with COVID-19, that's kind of trumped that whole story. But what I like about your book is you are an environmentalist, and that is the starting point, isn't it, I suppose, for you?
Yes, it is. Well, I have life science as my background, a PhD in education. I'm an expert on the subject of nuclear energy and energy in general. So I've tried to bridge the gap. I consider myself a practical environmentalist, not just talking about snails and trees, but also talking about the human beings on this earth and what they need in order to survive and how we can balance that with maintaining a good natural environment. And actually, we're doing an awful lot better than these people are telling us about how we're going to destroy the whole world in a short time. It's not true. And too many people are living in the artificial environments of cities with their video games, and they're basically a fake environment in many ways. I mean, the people out in the country who are cutting the trees and mining the ore and drilling the oil and gas, those are the people who are responsible for the people in the city being able to get up every morning with something to eat.
Yes.
And with something to heat their home with, and with concrete and steel to build their cities with, and they don't get it. They still think the milk comes from the corner store.
Yeah, and also I always think about the meat being packaged as well. If we forget, in Spain, the term for beef is vacuna, which is the same as cow, whereas in our English supermarkets we say beef. So it's kind of, we're disconnected from the real world, aren't we? Really?
Yes, and unfortunately today, mechanization is a wonderful thing. Technology, it has reduced the toil and backbreaking labor for millions of people, but it means that a majority of them are now in an artificial urban environment where they don't understand where the resources for their survival are coming from, and they've turned against them. In addition, they've been led to believe that carbon dioxide is a poison when in fact it's the basis of all life, and they are missing a little biochemistry there, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, I know I am missing a bit of biochemistry because I didn't do very well at school. But with all of this, just before we go on any further, just talk a little bit about your background, because I think that gives a bit of emphasis to anybody who hasn't heard of you before, with Greenpeace and some of the things that you've been involved with in your time.
Well, Dave, I grew up in an absolute wilderness on the northwest coast of Vancouver Island in the rainforest.
Beautiful.
On a floating village with no road to it. So it was completely unusual childhood in nature. And so that imbued me with an understanding of nature from childhood. When I went to boarding school, I had to be shipped away because this one-room school I went to only went to grade 8. So I went to Vancouver and started learning life science. And by the time I got to the University of British Columbia, I was already pretty familiar with the whole world of biology and genetics and biochemistry, etc. And I ended up enrolling in a PhD in ecology before that word had ever been printed in the media, or even or said in the media in the late 60s. And I guess you could say I became a born-again ecologist because I decided to campaign for an end to nuclear testing, an end to slaughtering the whales, and spent 15 years as a co-founder of Greenpeace and then a director in the top committee for the next 15 years. I was the lead spokesperson for Greenpeace for many years and actually was the titular head of it, the president of it for some time. But for the last 6 years, I was one of 6 international directors. But unfortunately, in the end, the only one with any formal science education. And Greenpeace went wonky and has continued now to actually be a very negative influence on our understanding of how nature really works and what we need to do to balance our needs with the needs of the natural world.
I was reading that this book is kind of aimed at parents to kind of teach their children about what's going on. And there is this, obviously, mainstream media emphasis on looking after our world. And we start off there, don't we? The very basic foundation is that you are somebody who cares about the planet. And that's a great foundation to start from, and we build from there, don't we?
Yes, it's been a lifelong focus of mine to work for causes that make the world better. But this is seen in a negative light by many people these days. People don't realize that our use of fossil fuels is actually increasing the vegetation and the trees and forests and food crops on the world immensely. It is the biggest factor in the reason why our food production is growing and why our trees and forests are expanding into areas that were too dry for them before. And Europe is an interesting example that way. You know, around 1800 and even before, Europe had got to where it had less than 10% forest cover because trees and wood, this is before fossil fuels, trees and wood were being used for energy for everything. Yeah. Heating every building, smelting iron and copper, glassworks, steam engines, you name it. It was wood that was the main fuel. Today, Europe has 43% forest cover, and there's still people talking about deforestation and the evils of using wood. Silviculture, which is the fancy name for forestry, was invented in Central Europe because the forests were decreasing to the point where they didn't have enough wood anymore, so they learned to farm trees. And that science of silviculture has spread to the rest of the world over the centuries to where today sustainable forestry is being practiced in India, in China, in Indonesia, all of North America, Japan, all of Europe. It's being practiced around the world. So we know how to keep the land forested. And people are talking about it as if we're denuding the whole place, when in fact our use of fossil fuels is actually providing a fertilizer. It's called the CO2 fertilization effect, or the greening of the earth. And it was first discovered in Australia by their research people there with satellite monitoring of the chlorophyll content of the landscapes around the world. The Sahara Desert has just grown by an area, has shrunk in the sense that it has greened by an area nearly as large as France and Germany combined in the last 20 years. NASA just put this out the other day. So we're getting one side of it from some people in Nassau, and then there's another group in Nassau who are preaching the end of the world due to carbon dioxide. It is causing the Sahara to green again as it was in past warmer and wetter eras.
It's amazing that, like you mentioned NASA there, and one organization can be teaching one thing and yet putting information out that kind of contradicts what they're teaching. And here in Spain, of course, under the European Union, Spain has gone very industrial as far as holidays and apartment blocks and so on. So they brought in these coastal protection laws in Europe, certainly in Spain, and Spain have broken those laws a few times and been fined by the European Union for doing so. So there is this need to protect certain areas of natural beauty, and I should imagine you would go along with that.
Yes, I do. But, living in the New World as I do in North America and in the whole of the Americas, they were still completely natural when Europeans came here such a short time ago. And it's the same for Asia. So the old world, Asia and Europe, didn't know about preserving nature in the past centuries. Yeah. And so there aren't as many huge parks like there are in North, Central, and South America. We have done that here beginning 100 years ago or more, making these vast areas of wilderness into protected areas, whereas they're pretty well postage stamp size by comparison in the European and Asian countries, and in some cases they're virtually non-existent. It is important to note, though, that even a commercial forest, as many of them are in Europe, is valuable from a biodiversity point of view. The difference between forestry and agriculture is that in agriculture, you don't want any other species there except for your crop. You don't want any insects. You don't want any animals. You just want wheat or corn or whatever it might be. Whereas with forestry, foresters don't mind if insects and birds and animals live in that forest, forest that's being used for producing wood. So it's a win-win game in forestry, and most people in the city don't understand that fundamental difference between forested landscapes and agricultural landscapes.
Yeah. Now, because of time, I'm going to try and go a little bit quicker here. Polar ice caps melting. I turn on BBC or Sky News or CNN, and I will see a big shaft of ice falling off the side of a cliff, and they're telling us it's shrinking each year. We just heard recently in the news that a big iceberg has broken away the size of a small country or something. I'm paraphrasing there. What's your take on that?
Glaciers made by snowfall on the land, and that creates a thick layer of ice, which then flows downhill continuously. It's a very slow motion. You can't actually see it in a day even. But all of these calvings of the glaciers have been going on since glaciers were formed in the Antarctic beginning 30 million years ago, and in the Arctic beginning 2.5 million years ago, which is what we call the Pleistocene Ice Age. We are still in it, and it's perfectly natural for the ice to flow to the sea. They're rivers of ice. It moves very, very slowly, but most people don't realize that, like glass, ice is actually technically a liquid, and it flows. It's plastic.
Yeah.
And the weight of the ice on the ground causes it to move downhill, just like water does, only much more slowly.
So in a nutshell, are they getting smaller or bigger right now?
Well, this is an interglacial period. So 20,000 years ago was the most recent glacial maximum. There have been about 40 of them. Most people think the Ice Age ended when the last major glaciation occurred. But no, there's been one after another for 2.5 million years. And we're in an interglacial period, which is a relatively warmer period. But we're still in the Pleistocene Ice Age, and the next major glaciation is set to happen 80,000 years from now. These are big cycles. They've been going on for millions of years. But the most important 2 points are, one, the world is colder now than it has been for 250 million years. That was when the last ice age happened. In between then and when this one came on, it was warmer all the time. And the second thing is that CO2, carbon dioxide, essential for life on Earth, is at the lowest it's been in this Pleistocene Ice Age in the history of the world. CO2 has continually declined in the atmosphere, while temperature has just gone up and down between ice ages and hothouse ages. So, and yet they're saying that in this last couple hundred years, our CO2 is the main cause of climate change. There's no truth to it.
So here's the big question then, and there's so many other things we could be talking about because of time. Why? In whose interest is it to say otherwise? I mean, there's so many scientists who are backing up government policies right now and saying that there's climate change and this and the other, and we've got to cut our CO2s by 2030. We've got to go all electric on our cars, is what the British government is saying by 2030. What's the agenda?
The agenda is among the activists, the media, the politicians, and the scientists. They are pushing scare stories that are either invisible or so remote that no one can check them for themselves. Why is it all about polar bears and coral reefs, things that people can't even go and look at for themselves to check whether or not they're doing fine? Polar bear population is growing and healthy and has been for 50 years. The coral reefs are healthy, and the biggest coral reefs and the most diverse coral reefs are in the warmest oceans of the world. Even though the world has cooled, the coral reefs have shrunk into the warmest oceans. This is a fact. The Coral Triangle in Indonesia is the warmest oceans and the most biodiverse coral reefs. So the reason they choose invisible and remote subjects for their scare stories is because people can't check for themselves. And those people that I mentioned, the activists, media, politicians, and the scientists on serial government grants, all have huge skin in the game. They are all making money from the scare stories. And if they didn't make scare stories, there'd be no money for them. That is the problem. And if you read that, people have to read my book to see that this is true. GMOs, what's in them? It's invisible. Radiation is invisible. CO2 is invisible. Polar bears are remote. Coral reefs are remote. The baobab trees of the African continent are remote to people. Yeah. So they make up stories to scare people about what's happening when there's no way people can check on it for themselves. You tell me a scare story, it is easy to check on. Yeah. And I'll tell you something that doesn't work. Because if it works, it's working because people believe the scare story, even though they can't check it for themselves. And people should think about this. Can they see what the carbon dioxide is doing? Can they see the polar bear population? No, they can't. And the fact is, a treaty in 1973 saved the polar bears from a decline due to overhunting, and now they've grown back to a very much larger population, and everybody's had the wool pulled over their eyes here.
And I should imagine that the scientists that you mentioned will actually quite happily call you a conspiracy theorist or fake news sort of thing. Because that, people say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And so quite often, I should imagine that your name has been dragged through the mire over some of the things that you're talking about in this book.
It is not a conspiracy theory. It is a convergence of interests. It's a different thing. It's not as if they're all behind closed doors somewhere. They're doing this right out in the open. But they can get away with it because people can't check for themselves about polar bears. If you study it, you will realize that the treaty between all polar countries in 1973 ended the unrestricted hunting of polar bears. That's why they have grown from about 8,000 to at least 35,000 today. It is a fact. It's been measured. It's in the literature. But it's not being talked about because they want to continue the scare story. So now that it is becoming quite well known, in fact, that the polar bear population is not declining, now they're talking about extinction in 2100. Yeah. Right? Now, quickly, it all gets pushed into the future.
Yeah, because we're running out of time here quickly, I wonder if you could do, I hate to put a time limit on you because I'm enjoying what you're saying, 2 minutes on why nuclear power is something that we should be using more, with the likes of the Japan, of course, that we heard about recently and issues there. And I know the Conservative Party in the UK want to try and bring more nuclear power in, and there's big campaigns against it. What's your take on nuclear power?
Fewer people have died in the entire 70-year history of nuclear energy than in one forest fire in California last summer. I mean, it's only one accident that has caused death, and that's Chernobyl, which is a stupid reactor design. The fact is all the other reactors are operating quite nicely, 440 around the world, 96 in the United States alone.
Wow.
France gets 70% of its electricity from nuclear and has barely over half the per capita CO2 emissions of Germany. So if you want to replace fossil fuels, electricity from nuclear energy is the answer for all buildings, all shipping, all trains, and anything stationary, in fact. All electric motors, all big steel works and cement works can be run with electricity from nuclear power. It's only vehicles and mobile technology that's more difficult because you can't hook up a car to an electric cord.
Yeah.
But, that's just a fact. But when it comes to the big tractors and combines and trucks used to get the food grown and into the city, we still will have to use some fossil fuels. But we could reduce it by 50% very quickly by building nuclear energy, and that is the only technology that can do that.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. It really is. I know I've really enjoyed chatting with you. I know I watched the TED Talk of yours that you did a few years ago online as well. So if folks want to find out more, they can look at that. And also the book, of course, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. It's a paperback. It's available from the 20th of January. It came out this year. And Dr. Patrick Moore, thank you for joining us here in Spain and bringing some good news, actually. So that's really good. And if you get the book, and it's designed, I think I mentioned this earlier, for parents to teach their children and to enlighten the parents out there. So Dr. Patrick Moore, thank you for joining us here on Talk Radio Europe. Thank you.